The rain had just stopped when the small white envelope slid under Sundar Pichai's hotel door. He had been packing for his early morning flight to Singapore, ready to attend a major conference that had been on his schedule for months. His suitcase lay open on the bed, half filled with neatly folded shirts and documents, but now his eyes were fixed on the envelope. There was no name, no return addressed, just a faint smudge on one corner, as if someone had handled it with damp fingers. He picked it up slowly, feeling the faint weight inside. It was too light to hold more than a single sheet of paper, or maybe a photograph. For a long moment, he simply stood there, staring at it, unsure why a sudden heaviness had settled in his chest. Finally, he tore the top open and slid out what was inside. It was an old, slightly faded photograph. In it, a woman with kind eyes and a warm smile sat on a wooden bench outside what looked like a small village house. Her hands were folded in her lap, and a bright sari wrapped around her in soft folds. The background showed clay walls, a modest doorway, and the shadows of trees overhead. There was something in her expression, calm, patient, timeless, that made Sundar feel as if she was looking straight into his heart. On the back, written in neat but slightly shaky handwriting, were 4 words. "She waited for you." Sundar sat down on the edge of the bed, his mind racing. He had never seen this woman before, but something about her face pulled at his memory. He thought of his mother, of his grandmother, of the countless women in India's villages, whose strength and grace kept entire families together through years of hardship. He turned the photograph over again, studying every detail. But there were no other clues, no date, no name, no signature. Just then, there was a knock on the door. Sundar slipped the photograph back into the envelope and opened the door to find a young hotel staff member, nervously holding his cap in his hands. "Sir, someone asked me to give this to you," the boy said, pointing to the envelope. "She said you would understand." "Who was it?" Sundar asked, his voice sharper than he intended. The boy shook his head. "I don't know, sir. She was an old woman. She left quickly. I think she took the lift to the ground floor." Without thinking, Sundar rushed past him into the hallway, heading for the elevator. But when he reached the lobby, scanning every corner, she was gone. The only thing he noticed was a faint smell of wet earth drifting in from the street outside, and the distant honking of traffic. He returned to his room, but the photograph wouldn't leave his mind. Who was she? What did "she waited for you" mean? And why did he feel, deep in his chest, that this was more than a random delivery? That night, he barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the woman's face again, come, steady, full of a kind of knowing that made him uneasy. By morning, instead of feeling excited for the conference, he felt something else entirely, a pull, quiet but insistent, telling him to stay. He sat at the desk, looking at his open laptop where his flight confirmation was displayed. His phone buzzed with messages from his team, reminding him of the important meeting awaiting him in Singapore. But then his eyes fell on the envelope again. There was no logical reason to change his plans. Yet, logic wasn't what was speaking to him now. Something deeper was telling him that if he left, he might miss a moment that could never be repeated. And Sundar Pichai was not a man who ignored such feelings. He took a deep breath, closed his laptop, and reached for the hotel phone. "This is Sundar Pichai, in room 1207, he said. "Please cancel my airport car. I will not be leaving today." As he hung up, the sound of rain starting again outside filled the room. It was as if the city itself was urging him to look for the truth hidden inside that small white envelope, and he decided that was exactly what he was going to do. The morning air was heavy with the smell of wet earth as Sundar Pichai stepped out of the hotel. His driver had been told to stand down, and now he was walking without any real plan. Only the photograph in his pocket, and a strange pull guiding his steps. The city was awake, but quiet, as if it too had slowed down to watch where he might go. He stopped at a small tea shop on the corner. The place was old, with faded blue paint on the walls, and a wooden counter that had seen decades of hands resting on it. Steam rose from a huge kettle, and the sound of boiling milk mixed with the clink of glasses being washed. Sundar took a seat on a wooden bench and ordered a cup of chai. As he waited, he pulled out the photograph and studied it again. An old man sitting across from him noticed and leaned forward slightly. "That's Hiraba Modi," the man said in a soft voice, as if he was speaking of someone sacred. Sundar looked up sharply. "You know her?" The man smiled faintly. "Everyone around here knows her. She is, how do I say it, not just a mother to her own children, but a mother to anyone who walks into her home. She gives advice like it is gold, and her words, they change people." Something in Sundar's chest tightened. "Where does she live?" The old man pointed toward the narrow lanes beyond the main road. "It's not far, but you should know. She doesn't meet everyone. People say she sees what is in your heart before she even offers you a seat. If she doesn't see truth there, she stays quiet." Sundar nodded, absorbing every word. He finished his chai and stood up, but the old man stopped him with a question. "Tell me, why do you want to see her?" Sundar hesitated. "I'm not sure," he said honestly, "but I think she may be waiting for me." The old man's eyes softened, and he gave Sundar directions. "Follow the lane with the red temple flag, turn left at the mango tree, and keep walking until you see a small bench under a neem tree. That's her house." Sundar thanked him and began walking. The lanes narrowed as he went deeper, the air thick with the scent of jasmine and spices. Children played cricket with sticks, stopping to stare curiously as he passed. Old women sat outside their doors, shelling peas into steel bowls, and shopkeepers called out greetings to each other. Finally, he reached the neem tree. The bench beneath it looked exactly like the one in the photograph. His heart began to race, but the seat was empty, and the doorway behind it was closed. He stood there for a moment, unsure what to do, when a thin man in a white kurta stepped out of a nearby house. He studied Sundar for a moment, then said, "You're here for Hiraba?" Nodded slowly. The man's gaze lingered on him before he spoke again. "She is not here right now, but if you really want to meet her, you will have to wait." There was something about the way the man said it, not just the words, but the weight behind them that made Sundar realize this was not going to be as simple as knocking on a door, and for the first time in years, he felt the quiet thrill of not knowing what would happen next. The thin man in the white kurta didn't invite Sundar inside. Instead, he gestured toward the neem tree bench and said, "Sit. I will bring you something." Then he disappeared into the narrow lane. The sun had started to break through the clouds, scattering light over the wet ground. Sundar sat down, the wooden bench cool under his hands. He could hear distant voices, the clang of a bicycle bell, and the faint rustle of leaves above. When the man returned, he was holding a small tin box. It was old and dented, the kind that might have once held sweets. Without a word, he placed it in Sundar's hands. "This is Hiraba's," the man said quietly. "If you truly want to understand why she may be waiting for you, open it." Inside the box were old photographs, letters written on yellowed paper, and a few dried flowers pressed between pages. Sundar lifted one of the letters, careful not to tear the fragile sheet. The handwriting was neat, though faded. It was a letter from a young mother to her son. In it, she wrote about the importance of kindness over ambition, of listening more than speaking, and of never forgetting the people who stood beside you when you had nothing. As he read, Sundar felt a strange heat behind his eyes. The words were not meant for him, yet they touched something deep within. The man watched him for a moment before speaking. "Hiraba writes letters to people she cares for. Sometimes she gives them in person, sometimes she keeps them, waiting for the right day to hand them over. This letter," he nodded at the one in Sundar's hands, "she never sent. She said it would find its way to the right person on its own." Sundar looked up, and, "You think that person is me?" The man gave a faint shrug. I don't think. I just follow her instructions. 2 days ago, she told me. Give this photograph and this letter to the man who looks like he's forgetting where he came from. The words landed like a stone in Sundar's chest. Forgetting where he came from. He thought of the life he had. Built meetings, flights, decisions that affected millions. He also thought of his childhood in Chennai. The small streets, the smell of hot idealists in the morning, the people who shaped him long before the world knew his name. He closed the box, gently. Where is she now? The man hesitated. She has gone to the temple outside the city, but she will return tonight. If you wait, you can meet her. Something inside Sundar knew he couldn't leave now. Not until he had heard her voice. As he handed the box back, the man said, people come to her with questions, but she does not always answer. Sometimes she tells a story instead, and in that story, you either find yourself or you realize you've been lost for a very long time. The rain clouds began to gather again, the air heavy and still. Sundar sat there, knowing that tonight might bring an answer or a truth he wasn't ready to face. And yet, he was ready to wait. The light was fading when the sound of soft footsteps came from the narrow lane. Sundar looked up and saw her Hiraba walking slowly toward the bench. She was shorter than he expected, her shoulders slightly bent with age, but her presence carried a quiet strength that made the whole lane seem to still. She wore a pale sari, the edges damp from the evening air, and in one hand she carried a small cloth bag. When her eyes met his, Sundar felt as if she had already read every thought in his mind. She gave a faint smile and sat beside him without a word. The neem leaves above them swayed gently, and the scent of wet earth lingered between them. For a long time, they simply sat there, the silence both strange and comfortable. Finally, Hiraba spoke, her voice low but steady. You came. Sundar nodded. I received your photograph. She tilted her head slightly, as if studying him. It was not mine to give. It was yours to find. The words caught him off guard. I don't understand. She reached into her cloth bag and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. This is the rest of the letter you were given earlier. It was never finished. I kept it, waiting for the day someone would need to hear it in person. He unfolded the paper, but before he could read, she began to speak. You can travel the world, sit in rooms where decisions shape the future, and still forget the road that brought you there. Sometimes, the greatest danger is not losing everything, it is forgetting that you once had nothing. Sundar's chest tightened. Are you saying, I've forgotten? Hiraba looked straight into his eyes. I am saying you have been walking fast. Too fast. You are chasing days and missing moments. People who matter are waiting for you, and you are telling them you will see them when you have time. But time is not promised. Not to anyone. He looked down at the photograph in his hand. But why me? Why send this to me? She gave a faint smile. Because the boy in you would have understood. I am just hoping the man you became still remembers how to listen. The words struck deep. Sundar thought of his family, of friends he had promised to call but never did, of the festivals missed, the small gatherings skipped for meetings and flights. Hiraba stood, slowly, leaning on the bench for balance. I do not ask you to stop what you are doing. I only ask you to make space for what matters. And sometimes, what matters is not in the plan you made for tomorrow, is in the person who needs you today. A sudden gust of wind sent a shower of neem leaves down around them. Sundar felt the truth in her words, sharp and undeniable. As she began to walk away, she turned back once more. You have a journey ahead of you, Sundar, but maybe it is not to the place you thought. And then she disappeared into the dimly lit lane, leaving him with the photograph, the unfinished letter, and a choice that would not let him sleep that night. The night felt heavier than any Sundar could remember. He sat by the window of his hotel room, watching the rain fall in silver lines under the streetlights. The photograph lay on the table beside him, the edges curling slightly from the damp air. The unfinished letter was still folded in his pocket, but its words echoed in his mind like they had been carved there every few minutes. He would glance at his laptop where his rescheduled flight confirmation sat open. Singapore was waiting meetings, speeches, faces he had promised to see. It was important work. But Hiraba's words had stirred something inside him that would not rest. Time is not promised. Not to anyone. Just before dawn, he made his decision. He picked up his phone, opened his calendar, and began canceling everything for the week ahead. His assistant called twice in confusion, asking if something urgent had happened. Sundar simply replied, "Yes, something urgent has happened." He gave no further explanation. He stepped out into the early light, the city still waking up. The air was cool, the streets almost empty. He retraced his steps to the narrow lane with the neem tree, hoping to see Hiraba again. But when he arrived, the bench was empty. Instead, the thin man in the white kurta was sweeping the ground. "She left before sunrise," the man said. "She asked me to give you this." He handed Sundar a small, wrapped bundle. Inside was a worn diary, its pages filled with careful handwriting. "These are her thoughts from many years," the man explained. "She said you would understand the last page." Sundar opened the diary and flipped to the end. The final entry was dated only a week ago. It read, "When the right person comes, they will not be here to take something. They will be here to give something back. I hope he knows what it is before it is too late." He closed the diary slowly, his throat tightening. "Where did she go?" Sundar asked. "To a village 2 hours from here," the man replied. "She is visiting someone, an old friend who cannot walk anymore. She will return in a few days." Without a second thought, Sundar said, "I'll go there." The man's eyebrows rose. "Are you sure?" "It's not an easy trip. Bad roads, no proper transport." "I'm sure," Sundar said firmly. "Tell me how to get there." And so, as the first true rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, Sundar found himself in the back of a rattling jeep, heading toward a part of the country he had never seen before. He had no idea what he would find, or why this pull felt stronger than any meeting, any stage, any promise of applause. All he knew was that he wasn't chasing business anymore. He was chasing something far more important, though he still didn't have the words for it. The road to the village was rough, winding through fields that glistened with rainwater. The jeep jolted over every bump, but Sundar barely noticed. His mind was fixed on the diary in his lap. He had read it 3 times already, each page filled with thoughts that were simple but carried a weight far beyond their words. By late morning, the jeep pulled into a small settlement. Houses made of mud and brick lined the narrow paths. There, walls painted with hand-drawn patterns. Children ran barefoot through the puddles, laughing, while women carried brass pots of water balanced on their heads. The driver pointed toward a low house, shaded by a large banyan tree. "That is where she is," he said. Sundar stepped down, his shoes sinking slightly into the wet earth. As he approached the doorway, he saw Hiraba sitting on a mat inside, her hands gently holding those of an elderly man who lay on a cot. His hair was white, his skin weathered, but his eyes lit up when he saw her. Hiraba looked up at Sundar, her expression calm, as if she had been expecting him all along. "You came," she said simply. He stepped inside and folded his hands in greeting. "I had to." She nodded toward the man on the cot. "This is Devendra. Years ago, he helped me when I had nothing. I promised him that if he ever needed me, I would come no matter where I was. Today, I keep that promise." The old man's voice was faint but clear. "I told her not to trouble herself, but she never forgets her words." Hiraba turned to Sundar. "You see, it is easy to keep promises when it is convenient. The real test is keeping them when it is not. You are a man with great reach, Sundar, but there are people waiting for you who do not care about your title or your success. They care only that you show up when they need you. Her words sank into him like rain soaking dry soil. He thought of people in his life, his own family, old friends, mentors' faces he had not seen in years because his schedule was always too full. He thought of the letter, the diary, and how each step of this journey had been pointing him toward the same truth. Hiraba smiled faintly. I sent you the photograph because I knew you would understand her eyes before you understood my words. Sometimes a picture can open a door the mind has kept closed for too long. She gestured toward the diary in his hand. Now you must decide what you will give back. Not to me, but to those whose lives were part of the road that brought you here. Outside, the rain had stopped and sunlight poured over the fields. Sundar felt something shift deep within him, understanding that no meeting, no award, no stage could replace the quiet power of showing up for the people who mattered. He looked at Hiraba, then at Devendra, and said softly, I think I know where I have to go next. Hiraba's eyes warmed. Then go. And remember, it is never the miles that make the journey hard, it is the moments you hesitate to take the first step. As Sundar stepped back into the sunlight, he knew his travel plans had changed again. But this time, the destination wasn't on any business itinerary. It was a journey home. The bus ride back toward his hometown felt longer than any flight Sundar had ever taken. There were no screens, no meeting notes to review, no assistants rushing in with updates, just the sound of wheels on wet roads and the occasional call of a street vendor when the bus stopped at small towns along the way. The diary rested in his lap, the photograph in his shirt pocket, close to his heart. As the landscape rolled past, Sundar thought about the years that had slipped away. Every step of his career had been a climb, each success followed by the next goal, the next challenge. And yet, the faces from his earliest days, the ones who had celebrated his first small achievements, who had stood by him when no one knew his name, had slowly faded from his calendar. When the bus reached the station, closest to his childhood home, Sundar stepped down and took a small auto rickshaw through narrow lanes, lined with old banyan trees. He remembered every turn, every shop sign, every faded wall painted years ago. Finally, the auto stopped outside a modest two-story house. The paint had peeled in places, and the iron gate creaked as he pushed it open. An elderly woman sat on the veranda, her eyes straining to see who had come. When she recognized him, her hands flew to her mouth in shock. Sundar said softly. Tears filled her eyes as she stood slowly, her steps unsure, but determined. I thought you had forgotten, she whispered. He shook his head, stepping forward to hold her hands. I did not forget, Uma. I only let the days run too fast. I'm sorry. They sat together on the veranda, talking until the light began to fade. She told him about the neighbors, about friends who had asked about him, about the festivals he had missed. He listened without interruption, each word reminding him of the life that had shaped him long before titles and stages. That night, he stayed in his old room. The walls still held the marks where he had once pinned drawings and old calendars. On the small desk sat a faded notebook, his first notes from school, written in careful, uneven handwriting. He smiled, touched by the way time had preserved these small pieces of who he once was. In the morning, he called Hiraba. I kept my first promise, he told her. Good, she replied. Now keep the others. Call the friend you haven't called in years. Visit the teacher who still remembers your face. Send a letter to the one who thinks you have forgotten them. These are the meetings that matter most. And so he did. Over the next weeks, Sundar visited people who had been part of his early journey. His first school teacher, a neighbor who had once lent his family money during a hard month, an old friend who had worked beside him at a small shop during his student days. Each visit brought smiles, laughter, sometimes tears, but always the same truth. They had not needed anything from him except his presence. When it was finally time to return to his official work, Sundar felt lighter, not because his schedule was empty. It wasn't but because his heart no longer carried the weight of all the "I'll see you when I have time" promises. He had made the time. Before leaving India, he made one last visit to the neem tree. Hiraba was sitting on the bench, the morning light falling across her face. She looked at him, and without words, he knew she understood everything that had happened since the day the envelope slid under his hotel door. He handed her the diary. "I think I gave something back," he said quietly. She smiled, her eyes warm and knowing. "Then you have learned the truth. Success is measured not only by how far you go, but by who you remember along the way." And as he walked away from the neem tree, the rain began to fall again, soft, steady, and full of the same quiet grace that had brought him here in the first place. The journey that began with an old photograph had brought him home, not just to a place, but to himself.